Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of the Haitian Annual Assembly of Orthopedic and Trauma. My name is David Shear, and I work at UCSF and the Institute for Global Orthopedics and Traumatology. This is going to be actually a short series of talks delivered by myself and Dr. Sam Morshed, my partner. And we'll be talking about some fundamentals of research methodology, and we're going to use this conceptual framework. What we're going to try to do in this series of talks is walk through going from an idea, could be any idea, a clinical question that you have in your everyday practice, and taking that idea and turning it into a research question or a testable hypothesis. Once you have that testable hypothesis, we'll try to help give you some guidance on how to go from that research question into a full research proposal. And from there, the final step is taking that proposal and implementing it into a research protocol, something that you could actually implement in some of the more nuts and bolts of doing clinical research. So this first talk is about taking a clinical idea and turning it into a question. And I would argue that this is the most important of all of these talks, because all the fancy statistics and study designs and things in the world cannot compensate for a bad research question. So this is really, I think, probably where you should spend the most time in a research study, is just picking the right question from the very beginning. And the learning objectives for this talk will be, it'll be a two-step process. So the first step is taking the clinical question and refining it into a testable hypothesis. And we can do that using a simple acronym known as the PICO method, P-I-C-O. And then the second stage of it is, once we've gone through PICO, we'll talk about how we can decide whether a question is worth asking. Are we willing to really commit the resources? And we'll do this using a framework known as FINER. And it's often said that ideas are cheap. It's easy to come up with clinical questions. I'm constantly in the operating room asking, what's better, this or another thing? It happens multiple times in a case, but it's not feasible. Although we could design a research question around any one of those dilemmas that arise in our everyday clinical practice, only some of them are going to be feasible for us to actually do a research study on. And so hopefully with these two methods, we can help with deciding which one of these we really want to pursue. So we'll begin with this example, and we'll use this example throughout this series of talks. And this example starts with a clinical problem that I think is common throughout the world. And that's that open tibia fractures have a high rate of infection, and there's uncertainty about whether we should use internal or external fixation. So at this point, it's just a problem, but how can we take this and turn it into a testable hypothesis? This is the research question I would argue that we're shooting for. In adults with open tibial shaft fractures, is there a difference in the rate of reoperation for deep infection comparing statically locked intramedullary nailing and uniplanar external fixation? You can see how much detail is embedded in this. There's a lot of information in this one research question that's really going to guide all the subsequent steps of developing a proposal, coming up with eligibility criteria, all the things that we'll talk about in some of the subsequent talks. So how can we systematically go from this problem statement to a real defined research question? So PICO is a nice framework for doing that. PICO stands for population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. It's a very simple framework, but it's an exercise that I still go through every time I'm thinking about a new research question. The population is pretty self-explanatory. It's who will be included in the study. And ideally, you be as specific as possible. Some examples of things that might be helpful for this in trauma studies would be things like age, the anatomic location, or maybe characteristics of the injury. Not all injuries are created the same, so we might incorporate some element of injury severity, whether it's an open or closed fracture, things like that could all be key aspects of our population. The I and the C are intervention and comparator, and this is the treatment that we want to test, that we're interested in. And typically, the intervention is the thing that's kind of new or investigational is our intervention. In this case, we're going to be looking at a statically locked sign nail. And then the comparator is what's kind of the current standard of care, which depending on the setting might be a uniplanar external fixator. The outcomes are what you will use to compare the intervention and the comparator, and there are a variety of different outcomes that you can choose from. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the proposal development phase, but it could range anything from clinical endpoints to X-ray outcomes to cost. The key thing when it comes to developing your question is that you really have to design your study around one primary outcome. And that's what your power analysis and all those things will be based on. So coming back to our research questions, so our population we've stated, we could say, well, we're not interested in kids. We don't want to look at closed fractures, and we want to focus on the tibial shaft rather than getting into pilons and plateaus. So our population could be adults with open tibia shaft fractures, OTA type 42. Our intervention, as I mentioned, is going to be statically locked intramedullary nailing, and we're going to compare that to a uniplanar external fixator. We're not looking at ring fixators or something like that. And our outcome is going to be reoperation specifically for deep infection, because we were really concerned about this infection question. So how do we take that outline of PICO and convert it into a question? Well, almost no matter what you said for the PICO, you can just sort of plug it into this and say, in the population, is there a difference in outcome comparing the intervention to the comparator? So here's the example: in adults with open tibial shaft fractures, is there a difference in reoperation comparing intramedullary nailing and external fixation? You can read that, but you can see how you can just take the answers in your PICO and just plug it right into a research question. So that's the first step. So now we have taken our clinical question, and now we have a refined testable hypothesis in our more refined research question. So the next step is we're going to want to think about what kind of study design we would use to answer this question. And I'm not going to go through this in great detail because Dr. Morshed is going to have another talk on controlling bias, and he's going to go into each of these study designs in more depth. So I'm just going to give you the quick and dirty here, which is that there's a pyramid of evidence. At the highest level are randomized trials, and at the bottom, level 5 evidence is just expert opinion. And as we go lower down on the pyramid, there tends to be more and more bias and lower and lower quality of research. But on the other hand, the resources also get higher as you go further up. So there's a trade-off essentially between the resources required to perform a study and its ability to answer that question without bias. And as we go into the next phase of thinking about whether our trial is feasible or not, sometimes we may start thinking that at the highest level of the pyramid and having to move down the pyramid a little bit in order to make our study more feasible. And this is a careful balance that you have to go through as you're going through this next step of the process, which is called FINER. It's an acronym to help us decide whether our project is feasible. And this isn't necessarily something where you go through it one time and you decide, nope, it's not worth it. It might be that you go through it once with one idea in mind of how your study might go, and you find that it's not feasible, and then you go back, you make some changes to your study design or changes to the research question or outcomes that you want to look at, and you make it more feasible, and it becomes a question that's worth asking. So just bear that in mind as you're going through this. This is not a one-shot deal. You may go through multiple iterations of your project before you're ready to take it on to the next step. So what does FINER stand for? Let's jump into this. So what is the acronym? So it's feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. What does each of these mean? Well, the F is for feasible, and feasibility is probably the number one thing that shoots down a research idea. And there are a number of things that go into feasibility and whether a project is realistic to complete. One of the biggest things is sample size. And if you're going to try to do it all, a study, looking at infection rates at your center and you don't see a lot of infections, then it's just simply not going to be feasible to answer that with a randomized trial. But sometimes by changing your research design, maybe you involve other centers, maybe you change your outcome to something that's a little bit more common, or study population to something more common, that might change. The bottom line is you need to have the sample size for it to be feasible. time is a big aspect of feasibility. Do you actually have time to collect the data, or the time to conduct the study? If you don't, do you have the funding to hire somebody to help you? If the answer to both of those is no, then it may not be feasible to do, a prospective, study that involves a lot of data collection. But doesn't mean you can't do it. Just means you may have to modulate your study design a little bit. But feasibility is one of the most important things, and it's important to really put a lot of thought into this before you embark on a project. Interesting is pretty self-explanatory. If you're gonna be spending, sometimes these projects can take years to complete, and if for you to get through all that, it needs to be interesting to you, and it also, you would hope, would be interesting to others at the end. You don't want to pick something that's not going to sustain your interest over the full course of completing the project. N is for novel, which means, has this study been done before? And every time I come up with a new research idea, the first thing I do is I go to PubMed and I do a big search and I see what else is out there. And sometimes you find that, somebody's already done, a really good study that already answers your question, and then it's really not necessary to do it again. But other times, there's a real need for it, or maybe it hasn't been done in your setting, and maybe it's not generalizable to where you are. And so there are other ways that it can be novel, but this is an important starting point. Ethics is critical and can't be emphasized enough. Not all research questions are ethical, and this can depend on study design. A classic example would be looking at delays in treatment. So you might be really interested in whether delay matters, but it's not ethical to randomize patients to a delay. You couldn't do a randomized trial looking at early versus delayed treatment, because who would want to have a coin flip for whether their surgery is timely or not? But that's something sometimes it can be addressed simply by changing it to an observational study, recognizing that may add bias. Ethics is going to be the priority. And then the last is relevance. Will your research project in some way change clinical practice or influence policy in some way? And this is, one of the most important things. You've got to make sure that you don't want to just be doing a project to get yourself a publication or something like that. There should be in some way that it may ultimately change the way patients are treated, or at least the way decision makers approach a problem. So I think this is really important. Once you've gone through this and you have your research question, then you just have to ask yourself, based on all that, is it worth answering this question? And are you willing to commit the resources? The number one of which is going to be your own personal time and effort. Hopefully, after you've gone through this process and iterated a little bit, the answer to this will be yes, and you can move on to the next steps that we'll talk about in taking your project and developing it into a more formal proposal. So the take-home points from this talk are to remember that developing a good research question involves the PICO method: population, intervention, comparator, and outcome. And then once you have that good testable hypothesis, you can use the FINER method: feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant, to help you decide whether you want to pursue addressing that question. Thank you.